Hey guys, so what I did for this video is survey the players in the Mikanko Discord and Facebook groups just to gather their thoughts in terms of the key strengths, key weaknesses, and much more about this deck. So definitely a huge thanks to all of you who responded and shared this survey, and a big thanks to those in the Mikanko Discord for helping me understand this deck a little better, because I still have a lot to learn for this deck. So definitely check me out on Twitter if you don't want to miss out on these kind of surveys and any other kind of surveys that I do. I also want to highlight Yu-Gi-Oh! He does create some good content in terms of Mikanko, so if you want to learn more about this deck, definitely go check his channel out. I'll have that link in the description below. Alright, so I'm actually clipping this in after I recorded everything, so the setup might seem a little bit off, but basically I have some really good news. I actually just partnered up with a new store based in the US trading card mint, formerly known as Yu-Gi-Oh! Mint, so you can actually use code Hakuna7, all lowercase, to get 7% off on YGO singles and sealed product. They already have existing sales going on right now for like money cards like, SP Wanted, so you can certainly go check that out and use my discount code. And also I do have a TCG Player affiliate link now, so you can also try to use that time to time if you have the chance and shop on that website. Anyways, let's just start with Mikanko. For this one, it's a little complicated because there's a variety of different builds, and in particular, there's builds that go first and then actual going second, kind of break your board kind of strategy. So I actually wanted to try my best to capture that information. So for one, majority of the survey respondents, so 80%, were actually playing going first builds, and about 20% going second. Now, does that actually mean that most Mikanko players out there are predominantly playing going first? I mean, maybe, but at the same time, you do have to be mindful of the very small subset of that Mikanko population that I surveyed. In terms of the actual packages played for going first builds, and of course, there's a lot, and these are not mutually exclusive, right? Like, you can play Ken and Gem package and also Infernal Knight stuff and the Diabell Star stuff all together, so it doesn't really highlight that in this graph. It's more so just, what are the most common packages that are played. There are also a bunch in the other as well that were just like all over the place that I wasn't able to really summarize very well, but for the most part, there's a lot of different ways to play it, of course, but kind of like the hand ripping with, like, let's say Ken and Gen triple tactical, so Neo Space Connector. I think that is something that's pretty favorable right now. Now, in terms of, the difficulty of piloting this deck, and I'm going to split a lot of the results by going first and going second builds. So for the going first build, in terms of difficulty, it averages out around 6.4, which is actually not that high, at least compared to some of the other decks that I've surveyed. Of course, they're not the exact same respondents, but at the same time, let's say with the going second build, this was actually even lower at 5.3 in terms of, how difficult it is to pilot the Mikanko deck. And then in terms of the consistency of the deck, again, now highlighting the going first builds, about 7.3, ranging from 3 to 10. And then for the going second build, it was a little bit higher, 7.8. And part of this probably also has to do with the fact that, you are going second build, like you basically start with 6 cards instead. That's always going to make the deck inherently more consistent as well. And so that's something to consider. Now, in terms of what tier you would categorize Mikanko, for the going first build, most actually put it at tier 2, about 2/3 put it at tier 2, which I think is actually fair considering the YCS tops that it's had, and multiple tops at that, so it's not just a one-off fluke or anything. It's definitely shown promise, and I think even now, I think a lot of people still don't really know what the deck does, but I think they do have to start respecting it if they haven't already. For the going second version of the Mikanko deck, most actually put it at Rogue. Again, kind of keep in mind the small sample size for the going second build. It's only about 22 responses, but that actually is kind of interesting to nonetheless. Now, in terms of, the key strengths of this deck, this one I'm just going to more so overall summarize all builds. Is variety of different builds, as we kind of been talking up until now. There's so many different ways to play Mikanko, so I think that's one of the key strengths. You kind of play, in the way that it interests you and you feel most comfortable with. And I kind of alluded to this earlier, players not knowing how to play against it. I think this is definitely always like a strength, especially for rogue decks. For Mikanko, even though with those multiple YCS tops, I feel like a lot of players still don't really know how to play against this, myself included, of course. So that is something, though, that you can't really rely on for too long, though, if it continues to get success, of course. And that is something that, you have to at least try to start assuming that, your opponents will actually know what they're doing. Now, in terms of easily summonable towers, honestly, I find Mikanko cards like a headache to read when there's multiple of them all in circulation. I just kind of assume that they just can't be targeted or can't be destroyed by battle or can't be destroyed by card effects. So those are things that, for some decks might be actually pretty hard to out, not to mention they actually can also inflict damage to you instead, which is like crazy. And then finally, just powerful and flexible end boards in terms of going first, but also with that inherent ability to go second for those going first builds, right? Just because of the way Mikanko cards work and just being able to deal a lot of damage, not being destroyed by battle, and just being able to go second really well, even for those that are intentionally trying to go first. Okay, so now to kind of rate the deck's ability to go first, and we're gonna again try to split the results by going first and going second builds. So for the going first build, obviously this is kind of like their optimal way of playing. So in terms of going first, they actually are averaging around 7.8, so it's pretty fairly strong as well. For those going first builds, when they go second, they also put it at 7.8, which is actually quite high. And again, we kind of alluded to this before, where this deck just inherently has a good ability to go second just because of how the Mikanko cards actually work. Now, in terms of the going second builds, of course, they want to go second, so if they're forced to go first, they're not going to do too well, so they actually put it at 5.4. So the numbers actually kind of align with, at least the theory aspect of that. Of course, going second, though, for these going second builds, which is their kind of bread and butter, that is about 8.7, which is quite high, but again, understanding the small sample size. So now let's cover the typical end board for Mikanko. And so I asked this question for any meta deck that I survey, and sometimes they're very straightforward typical end boards, but at the same time, for some decks it's very difficult to outline a typical end board, especially for now Mikanko, because as we mentioned, there's so many different variants, so it is pretty challenging. So instead, I'm going to try to just cover more so the core aspects of Mikanko, interruptions that they can put up, and then you can at least use that information. So for one, you have to be, at least this is also for just going first builds, the special summon lock through Acid Golem is something you of course have to be aware of, where they basically give you this monster through Geonator the Link 2, and then you're just essentially kind of locked with this like monster where you cannot special summon at all. So that's something to be mindful of. And then the actual Mikanko side of things, you have like a monster and an equip spell. I think typically their preference is to have Huli as well as the Mayo spell. So the Mayo can provide like essentially in combination, they kind of provide like essentially like targeting or battle or card destruction protection, and Mayo can also do some bouncing as well. They also have some traps available. The first one, like the Spear Walk, essentially takes like your opponent's monster, is how you can see it. The Rivalry equips the opponent's monster with an equip spell, and they also have an equip spell that takes the opponent's monster. So I guess they kind of do similar things. And then you also have something like Ohime, which can equip from the grave, and that's something that this Rondo card, which essentially steals your opponent's monster. And I believe, ruling perspective, even though inherently equip cards target, the way Ohime works, it actually bypasses that from my understanding and still equips it to the opponent's monster, and then you take it. If you play Mikanko, definitely correct me if I'm wrong, but that is what I heard. Now, of course, there's always different variations of the end board that you have to be aware of, and with this deck, especially with all the different variants, I mean, there's other options like SP Little Knights, kind of a given with most decks, just 2 monsters make this anyways. I believe if they don't go for the Acid Golem lock, they try to end on like something like Apo and Herald of Arclight, and Herald of Arclight has aside from the Omni Negate itself, it actually does have kind of like that banish effect from like monsters that are sent from hand or deck, so that kind of actually comes up later when it comes to Forbidden Droplets. And of course, Barone is another Omni Negate that a lot of decks can put up as well, and there's also different interruptions on top of that. Don't forget, there's also potential hand rips, right? Like if they play Dolphin, that's a hand rip, or like Ken Gen Triple Tactic Talents, like that's another thing that you have to be mindful of as well. Alright, so now let's cover which hand traps are the most impactful against Mikanko, and I'm going to try to split the results again by going first and going second build, but I'm just going to provide commentary just for the going first build, and then just show you what it looks like for the going second build, because for the most part they kind of line up anyways. So for Mikanko, it looks like Droll was most number 1 in terms of impact, because they do search a lot. I mean, any kind of, I guess, Izolde, like Warrior Turbo, like typically are going to search a lot, so that's always nice. Shifter also is strong. I mean, realistically, you can say this about most decks. It's not that surprising, but they are pretty grave reliant. They also, especially like with their equip spells, for needing them to be in grave. Ash, just kind of generic. Nibiru, I believe from what I read from the respondents, is that if you at least have Nibiru, it can stop the Acid Golem lock, but I believe they can like pivot to other directions and have like Appaloosa or Herald, or certainly correct me if I'm wrong, but at the very least, if you can stop Acid Golem lock, I guess it's worth it. You also have something like Crow against some of the equip spells, can be also very, very impactful as well. Is it seeing that much play? Kind of. I think like hand in hand with like Bestials, you do have something like Tier Limits and Unchained still in the format, and also DD Crow can be good against Pearly as well. Impervailer, like targeting cards, probably not amazing in a lot of cases, just because of like the Mikanko cards and their targeting protection, but I guess any deck that plays Izolde, like Impervailer on that, is always kind of nice. And the rest are probably not that great. Bell, I think, again, any kind of like grave removing kind of effect with like the equip spells, I guess, can also come up, but was not highlighted too high. In terms of the going second builds, this is basically kind of what it looked like. Again, I'm not going to provide additional commentary, but pretty much for the most part it looks to be similar. I believe Nibiru is not as impactful against the going second variants from what I read. In terms of board breakers that are good against the going first build, we do have Droplet being really high here. So again, because they essentially kind of struggle against like non-targeting removal, and Droplet effect negation in that regard that's not targeting is also very good, because the Mikanko monsters essentially become kind of like, you know, like a zero attack vanilla monster at that point, right? So at the same time, I did briefly mention earlier with like the Herald of Arclight thing and how monsters from hand or deck would have to get banished. So Droplet, you would have to essentially not be able to send monsters from hand, at least in that case if Herald of Arclight is on the field. Book of Eclipse, the reason this is also high is because essentially when, you know, the monsters are flip face down, all the equips actually just kind of get lost and go to the grave basically, so that's why it's good. Back removal is also kind of nice just because of the equip spells providing those additional forms of protection, so those are not too surprising. Now, at the same time, they also have access to Angel Ring, I believe probably post-die for the most part, which essentially kind of deals with like most of the spells out there, right? Except for like, I guess, Super Poly, but Super Poly is not amazing against this deck for the most part. Sometimes they can play into it, but for the most part, they have like a lot of different attributes, so it's not that great. And also, I should mention, you know, board breakers like Lightning Storm and Evenly Matched in particular, because you probably would have Acid Golem on your field, those cards would be dead as well, so those are things to consider. And then this is just what it looks like for the going second builds. Again, pretty similar, and Droplet being number one here. And again, keep in mind, because of the small sample size, you know, it would be the results will be a little bit more volatile for all the going second results. So you do have to keep that in mind. So don't pay too much attention in terms of the exact order of certain cards. And finally, in terms of which floodgates are most impactful against Mikanko for the going first build, we have Skill Drain. We kind of talked about this in terms of Forbidden Droplet. You know, if their effects are negated, they're basically a vanilla zero attack monster, which is not very good. Anti-Spell is also kind of like tied up there because, you know what, equip spells are spells. This card is really strong against a lot of different decks as well, and essentially pretty much everything else just kind of is a big tapered off compared to the other two floodgates, so those are things to keep in mind. Alright, so lastly, let's just cover some of the key weaknesses that the players highlighted for Mikanko. And the first is that, you know, just decks that play a lot of hand traps, as we saw, you know, Droll, Shifter, those are very critical against this strategy. Non-targeting removal, we kind of talked about this in terms of, you know, droplets, let's say even Book of Eclipse, just being able to get rid of those equip spells as well. Even something like, let's say, Branded has a lot of, like, non-targeting removal, that's what they're most known for, and players did definitely mention that, you know, Branded Chimera, Branded Despia are very bad matchups for this deck. Easy to interrupt when going first is something that came up multiple times among a lot of the players, and also bricking on equip spells, kind of similar to like Infernoble, I guess, in a way, where they do play a lot of equip spells, although, you know, that deck I think is actually still pretty insanely consistent. I'm not too sure about Mikanko, but I guess that is something that you always have to consider when you're playing that many equips. Back row heavy decks apparently is another struggle for Mikanko. And lastly, apparently it's straightforward to beat if the opponent actually knows what Mikanko does. So as I mentioned kind of at the beginning of the video, essentially, you know, if this deck continues to gain, you know, YCS level success, obviously this fact is not something that, you know, you can't really rely on too much for your opponent to not know what your deck does if it continues to get YCS level success, right? Eventually they're going to study up on it and be ready for it. But for now, I think they are still in that realm where a lot of people don't know what the deck does. Even after this video, I probably still will be very lacking in knowledge, so certainly something that I have to study up on as well. But I do think that this deck is still really cool, and I really do appreciate all of you for your honesty in terms of, you know, helping understand this deck a lot better. Anyways, guys, that was it for the breakdown of Mikanko based on the survey responses. Again, a huge thanks to all of you who responded and shared the survey. Really appreciate all your help, especially those in the Mikanko Discord group that really personally helped me a lot to get this survey going. So a huge thanks to all of you for watching. I'll probably survey Centurion next. I think that's going to be an interesting one. And then after that, I'll probably do Fire Kings because it'll be released around that time as well. So anyways, thanks to all of you for watching. A big thanks to my Patreons for the continued support. And well, take care, guys.